Leonardo DiCaprio.
Miss Anne Hathaway.
Meryl Streep, the Iron Lady.
Alan Arkin in Little Miss Sunshine.
Kevin Costner.
The King's Speech.
Birdman.
I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Redoing the Oscars. And here we are at the 1999 Oscars, starting off the 90s. If you don't know, we're now kind of in the little over the middle way part of the series. We started back in 2015, going every single year. Now we're in the 90s. We're going to do the 90s and then a couple years in the 80s, and then next thing you know, we're going to be back into Old's Oscar Countdown Season 11, predicting the Oscars. But this is a kind of a transitionary point into a new decade, and a decade in which I'm a fan of a lot of the films, fan of the Oscars, the kind of peak in many ways of the Academy Awards, at least in terms of a popularity, a telecast, kind of relevance point of view. And this is one of the best movie years ever. People have written books about 1999. It is a legendary year where there's a lot of options for me to choose from. So I thought this was a fun episode to do, and I'm excited to talk about things. But if you're new to the series, welcome. What I do every single week is pick a different Oscar category and redo it. I choose an alternative nominated pick that I think should have won, talk about why I think it's great, and celebrate just another performance that was nominated that just didn't end up winning. Or in the case of this video, the Best Director category, and talk about the film that ultimately didn't win, or the director that ultimately didn't win. And then I also like to talk about some historical context at the top of where we are. And I also like to give out an alternative non-nominated pick. A director, in this case, that wasn't nominated at all at the Oscars that I think should have. And in such a great movie year, this is definitely a fun one to kind of debate and talk about. Which brings me to you guys. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. I'd love to hear everyone's opinions as to which movies they would pick and which categories they would pick and all that good stuff. It's a fun little exercise that I like to do, but also I think opens up the community and those questions to yourself. So feel free to leave those comments down below. But without further ado, let's jump into things. I already started to get into that Oscars context, but let's get into it a little bit more. And this is a really great year for movies. A bunch that weren't nominated at the Oscars, unfortunately, though. But because it was such a great year for movies generally, they kind of stumbled into a couple of really iconic movies. And when you look at the Best Picture lineup, what's so fascinating about it is that I think for every right decision they kind of make a wrong decision. That there are some parallels even within the category. So this was only the time when we had 5 nominees. So you have a movie like The Sixth Sense, which is identifying a young filmmaker, an exciting filmmaker in M. Night Shyamalan, one of his most iconic movies. And I think that was a good thing. This is a movie that has stood the test of time. M. Night Shyamalan still making movies 30 years later, original movies for theaters. So he is a filmmaker, even though he's had his ups and downs, is a celebrated auteur of sorts still 30 years later. That is a testament to him and the Oscars kind of picking the right horse in that sense. But then they also picked, on the alternate side, kind of a young filmmaker at the time, which was Sam Mendes, and ultimately gave him the award for Best Director, which we are redoing on this episode. But he's a director who has had his ups and downs similar to M. Night, although I don't think has as much of a passionate fan base, because I think he's a little bit more of a working hand rather than like an auteur in the same way that someone like an M. Night is. So and I also don't think American Beauty is going to be as well remembered 30 years from now as a movie like The Sixth Sense. So it's like they pick one exciting filmmaker, it works out. They pick another young exciting filmmaker, and maybe less so. Similarly, with the other 2 nominees, not including The Insider, you have a movie like The Green Mile, which I know critics don't love, but it is a movie that amongst the regular people, a lot of people have seen. It's a very popular movie, and I think a really engaging movie. So it's a movie that I think is sweet and saccharine and very sentimental and earnest, but deserving so and genuinely moving. Then you have another sweet, saccharine, earnest movie that doesn't necessarily work and hasn't stood the test of time, The Cider House Rules. So it's funny how the Best Picture category kind of mirrors itself, in which they make one decision and then they make one wrong decision. But of course, the 5th nominee being The Insider, which I actually do think is a genuinely influential movie. It's a movie connected to another great American director in Michael Mann. So you have strong connection there in terms of its legacy. Although I don't necessarily think it's his best film, it was the kind of only opportunity Mann had in the kind of Oscars race. You think of so many of his great iconic movies like Heat or Last of the Mohicans, and none of those movies really resonate at the Oscars. The Insider was his only one. So who knows about Heat 2? Maybe that's going to be it. But to me, he is one of our premier filmmakers, and I'm excited to see what he does next. And I'm glad he's still making movies, even today, with major movie stars like Christian Bale, like Leonardo DiCaprio with his upcoming sequel to Heat. But then when you get into the acting performances, you have a really notoriously bad win, I think, in Michael Caine inside Our House Rules. Even though everyone likes Michael Caine, it did seem kind of odd win. Particularly in hindsight, I thought about redoing this category, but I wanted to, share my love for Michael Mann, and this is really the only opportunity I could go. But if I were to pick a performance category from this year to redo, it would be supporting actor, just because it seems like when you look at it from a historical perspective, you go, okay, Michael Mann won because he never won before, and he's a legendary character, British actor, so they had to give him something right. And you go, actually, no, just like 10 years earlier, or he won for Hannah and Her Sister, so he already had an Oscar, so why do they feel the need to give it to him? And then you look at all the other nominees. I mentioned Michael Clarke Duncan in The Green Mile, movie really beloved by the general public, even if it's not a critic's movie, so I think that would still be well regarded. But then you have Haley Joel Osment, who's amazing in The Sixth Sense, even though he's sort of the lead. And then you have, I think, I'd argue, two iconic performances. In Jude Law's best performance, the talented Mr. Ripley, and then you have Tom Cruise in Magnolia. Two actors who have gone on and continue to be in great movies and give great performances, and neither of whom have Oscars. The Tom Cruise one in particular, I thought about maybe doing this category to give him an award there. We may be redoing him and giving Cruise his rightful Oscar a few weeks from now. We'll stay tuned for that, but I thought about that category, but it's just a weird win for Michael Caine. Then Best Lead Actress, which is a weird category. I don't think it has a clear winner. Maybe you give it to Annette Bening because she's never won one before and she's a legacy actor. But the American Beauty is not necessarily her most iconic performance, and a bit of a weird one if you were to have won for that. And then same thing with the Best Lead Actor. Kevin Spacey does win for Best Actor. And at the time, it was seen as like, oh, he's one of our next great actors. Winning for Usual Suspects, winning for this, 2 Oscars at such a young age. Put him up there with a Tom Hanks, for example. And, I think he went on to continue to give some great performances. But, of course, because of the controversy and the allegations, there is going to be a weird stink around him and his performance and his wins and his legacy as an actor. So that's going to unfortunately taint the kind of Best Actor category. But even still, why I didn't consider redoing that was because who are we going to go with in the Best Lead Actor category? I mean, Richard Farnsworth, Legacy Award. I don't like Legacy Awards. Denzel winning for The Hurricane. I love Denzel. That's probably the 15th best Denzel movie. Same thing with Sean Penn. Would we have given him his 4th Oscar for the 15th best Woody Allen movie? And then you could go maybe with Russell Crowe for The Insider, who's excellent in the film, but he wins next year in 2000 in his rightfully iconic role for Gladiator. So it was kind of a weird choice to go with. Supporting actress, I liked Angelina Jolie in Girl Interrupted. So there was a kind of no clear alternative option aside from, if I were to pick one, be the supporting actor category. But then thought if I was going to do Cruise, maybe we can do Cruise in a couple of weeks later, which brought me to Best Director. So getting into things, my alternative nominated pick, who I think should have won Best Director at the 1999 Oscars, is Michael Mann for The Insider. Now, I've mentioned it already. I don't think this is his best film, but it is an excellent film. I like pretty much all of Mann's films, and I do think it is an influential film, which would have been apt to reward Mann for Best Director. And I think influential in the sense of treating corporate movies as thrillers. This is an underrated kind of a genre that doesn't always exist. I mean, we have certain movies in the history of cinema, like some of the journalism type movies, which are kind of related to corporate movies. You could even say a movie like Sweet Smell of Success, but that, in my opinion, is another category. The Insider really introduced kind of the merger of corporatism and corporate thrillers and legal thrillers and kind of journalism movies all in one. And in particular, how it's shot, Dante Spinotti, I think you see that influence all the way up until Margin Call or Severance in terms of some of its really tight close-ups. It's following behind characters. It's kind of weaving through mysterious hallways, adding into that sense of mystery and suspense that you could theoretically even connect to something like Backrooms. So I think its visual language is very inspirational. So I think you have to give Michael Mann a lot of credit there. And what's so fascinating about it, and I know this is a bit of a cliche, but he makes these kind of boardroom scenes seem like action scenes. This is an incredibly tense, incredibly thrilling movie. And Michael Mann, up until this point, you think of movies like Heat or Manhunter, they are mostly action movies. And this movie doesn't have a lot of action, except in some of these, tense dialogue scenes, and he uses a lot of those same techniques that he established and built as a filmmaker in those action scenes and applies them to this kind of corporate, or to these courtroom scenes or these kind of backroom dealing scenes that are incredibly engaging. Now, if you don't know, this movie is about a whistleblower, a scientist that worked for a tobacco company, one of the cigarette companies, and his process of trying to get an interview on 60 Minutes, breaking his confidentiality contract with the company that he worked for, and reveals to the public all the kind of harmful additives that are intentionally making cigarettes more addictive. And what I love about this film is ultimately its performances. It's an intense, engaging story. It's revolutionary, I think, in many ways of how it's shot and how you can see it with prestige TV today in terms of its approach to making these kind of corporate movies, thrillers, and engaging, just in terms of its camera movement, in terms of its pace, in terms of its engagement. The Insider really is revolutionary in that sense, and one of the first movies to take that approach to this world. But I also just like the movie because I like the movie and because I like the performances and because I think Michael Mann, who's always a great director of actors, is able to get some of the best performances from these three iconic actors in Christopher Plummer, Russell Crowe, and Michael Mann. Now, he's not as good on the female side of things. There's not a lot of interesting, well-drawn female characters in this movie, which you have to maybe kind of criticize it a bit for, but it's ultimately not interested in that. And what I also love about the movie is that every time I watch it, I come away with a different favorite performance. So you have to give a shout out to Christopher Plummer playing Mike Wallace, who has this kind of swagger that he walks around, knowing that he's the ultimate decision maker, the person in power. And then when he realizes in certain moments that he doesn't have that power, how he kind of loses it on certain people. There's some great moments of dialogue in the script, and I think Plummer is able to bring it to life in terms of some of his line readings that are so iconic. I think Russell Crowe is great, playing much older, but very believably so, much more internal and constrained until he has moments where he lashes out, in which he is very scary himself and uses some of his physicality that he was getting prepared for Gladiator. But the main performance that stood out for me this time around was Al Pacino. When we think of this era, we think of The Devil's Advocate and The Heat even, him being really over the top and kind of crazy. But this is, more of a 70s Al Pacino performance, more of a performance like Insomnia, Christopher Nolan from 2002, in which he's so great at feeling weathered and tired and through kind of sick of everything and been through the thick of things. When we see him at the opening scene in the movie, I love the way Pacino plays it, because he doesn't play it scared. He plays it like he's just dealing with, a bad day at a job and is tired and tired of everyone's kind of crap, even though he's in, a foreign country dealing with, a rebel leader and has a bag over his head and he doesn't know where he is. He's kind of just going through the motions. The clothes he wears, the way he carries himself is very kind of weathered down, and yet he still shows you why he's Al Pacino in certain scenes where he's incredibly clear, and you can see the frustration building, you can see some of that energy coming out. It's one of my favorite Pacino performances because it kind of contains both the 70s Pacino and the 90s Pacino, the internal kind of anguish and constraint and control with the blowing over the top, with the larger, with the kind of intense speechifying. It contains both, which makes it, I think, really interesting. So if we're going to reward Michael Mann with an Oscar, it's never happened before. He's one of my favorite filmmakers. I'd have to give him an award here for The Insider if we're redoing things. But someone who wasn't even nominated, that would have given Michael Mann a real run for his money, and my ultimate non-nominated pick would be David Fincher in Fight Club. And this was a really tough category to go with, just because I thought about, Eyes Wide Shut with a Stanley Kubrick. I thought about Spike Jonze for being John Malkovich. I mean, there's so many great films in this year. But wanted to go with David Fincher because ultimately I'm a Fincher guy, more so than I am a Kubrick guy or a Jones guy or anyone really else. He is up there with Michael Mann as one of my favorite filmmakers. And I know that this is somewhat of a controversial movie just because I think some people don't like the fans of the movie more so than they don't like the movie itself. I also think it's kind of a bit of a divide between young people and old people. I do think there's always a new young generation that really resonates with this movie. And as you get older, it seems that maybe people start to like it a little bit less. I'm still in the younger stage of my life, so I still appreciate its energy and its style and its exuberance and kind of my overarching take on the movie, which has been a movie that's been analyzed to death and talked about to death. It is a very popular movie to talk about and to share and to theorize about, but I think in part because it's so fun. But my kind of general theory is that I think the fact that this movie having, we'll call them kind of toxic fans, is a testament to how good it is. I think when some people think, oh, people get the wrong idea from the movie, they don't realize the power of these ideas, which in my opinion is a satire on when you have a bunch of lost, young, lonely men, they can be kind of manipulated and pushed into a certain set of ideals. So the fact that when people watch this movie and they see the idea of Fight Club and they're really engaged to it and they kind of feel that this is a celebration of those ideas, to me, it's a testament to the success of the film because it's when the satire becomes reality, when it becomes so sharp and so clever at identifying a certain subset of culture, so much so that they become fans of the movie for that subset of culture. It's an indicative of the power of that idea. The fact that this movie does have toxic fans indicates that there's a sense of truth, a real truth that the movie is tapping into. That when you have a bunch of lonely young men or young men without kind of any purpose in their life, they will channel that towards something. What that will be can be manipulated and co-opted by people with dangerous ideas, but that there is still people that when they are lost will gravitate towards a certain set of ideals, and whether that be Fight Club in the 90s or you could say Andrew Tate in the 2020s, there is always some sort of person that will capture the ideas and fascinations of young men across the country, because there's a sense of maybe lack of purpose or searching for identity that a new generation will always kind of claim to. And I think Fincher, expertly as a director, reflects that. When you have a movie that is about young people being intoxicated by an idea and satirizing the fact that they need to fight in order to feel and that they're so kind of devoid of their emotional senses that they need to kind of express it out in this outlet, well, how do you make that movie? How do you make it intoxicating? How do you understand the kind of appeal of the characters in the movie? Well, you make the movie exciting. You put great music in it. You have great imagery. You have this rapid fire pace. You have these characters that are in Brad Pitt, literally the idealistic version of a man, where you hear personal trainers on Instagram still talking about how guys go up to them and say, I want to look like this in Brad Pitt in Fight Club. I want my ideal body to be that. So you have kind of just a basic level visual making, iconic making status, understand the appeal of the power of some of these images, whether it be how handsome Brad Pitt is, whether it be how kind of drab the office life is and the Starbucks cups and all that kind of a color changing that's going on in the visuals of the movie, combined with some of the exciting, fast-paced performances by our three leads in Helena Bonham Carter, Edward Norton, and Brad Pitt. And I think just this an incredible script of how truly kind of cynical and acid-tongued it is in terms of its approach and view of the world, leading to what I think is maybe one of the most iconic shots in movies, the ending of the buildings kind of going up on fire and the two main leads holding each other's hands, kind of accepting what they have done and who they are. It is kind of a beautifully tragic image. And I think Fight Club is one of the most iconic movies in the 90s for a reason. It is expertly tooled. It is a beautiful kind of a collision of all these ideas and all these performers at the right time. And its legacy still persists today. So that's my spiel on Fight Club. This is a bit of a long episode, so let's wrap things up a little bit and talk about the final question. Did the Academy make the right decision? I'm going to go with no. I've been saying that a lot on recent episodes, but it is the point of the series to redo the Oscars. Although this isn't necessarily a definitive no. The Insider isn't Michael Mann's best movie. People may not even like necessarily The Insider. That may be more of a personal opinion. And I know I also have stuck up a bit in the past for a movie like American Beauty, which I think is a perfect representation of the 90s. But that can't be just it. It can't just be a representation of the period and mood of the time of the period. It has to also be standalone, a great piece of art. So while I can look at it from a kind of historical perspective and go, wow, that's fascinating that this really resonated and was a huge hit. Clearly this is indicative of how people felt at the time in 99 or in the 90s in general. But it is still a movie that I don't think necessarily totally stands alone. And then you have the fact of the Kevin Spacey drama and the fact that he's in every single frame. It's just not going to be a movie, unfortunately, that I think stands the test of time. Whereas The Insider, which may not stand the test of time either, I think is a movie that is influential for the upcoming decades, but is also an excellent movie that can stand alone on its own, which is why I think, if we're talking about Best Director, let's give it the big award to Michael Mann. He's one of our best filmmakers of, the 80s and 90s and 2000s. He's continually made great movies within those decades, and he's still making great movies today. And, you got to reward him with something, and he's never been rewarded. So we're redoing the Oscars. We're re-giving it to Michael Mann and kind of fixing the errors of the past. But if you want to see us fix other errors of the past, feel free to check out the other episodes, the other years. Feel free to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss next week's video. Monday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll be covering the year 1998. Stay tuned for the choice for that episode. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.